Domestic disputes. Like an elaborate episode of Dr. Phil, The War of the Roses offers us a chance to watch and enjoy some good old family squabbles. It's all fun and games until 50,000 people die. Hello and welcome to Feature History, featuring the War of the Roses, an epic century-long civil war that pitted brother against brother, father against son, and fifth cousin once removed against fifth cousin once removed, all for the grand prize of the English throne, because it was very, very comfortable. It brought dynasties to an end, impacted wars that would change history forever, ended the medieval era, and had two absolutely gorgeous flowers. I hope the edge of your seat is extra cushioned because we're going on a ride of drama. Our story begins in the late 14th century and carries to the 15th century. These two centuries were characterized in crisis. Famines, plagues, and the start of the adorably named Little Ice Age would bring Europe to its knees. With near-apocalyptic-like destruction at the hands of Mother Nature, war and revolt would become commonplace. Ever since William the Conqueror indulged in his namesake and conquered England in 1066, the ruling dynasties of France and England had been closely interlinked. It would typically lead to skirmish, but in 1337 the game would change. King Edward III of England believed he was the rightful heir to the throne of France, and when Philip IV challenged England's territorial claims, Edward responded by attempting to take the throne of France, beginning the 100 Years' War. Edward III's eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, was heir to the popular king and made good impressions with his success in the war against France. Those campaigns would take their toll though and kill the prince in 1376 by giving him a nasty case of the shits. Not too bad though, Edward III had three other living sons to take up the position of king: John, Duke of Lancaster, Edmund, Duke of York, and Thomas, Duke of Gloucester. Edward III died a year on from his eldest in 1377, and the throne was left to Richard II, the son of the Black Prince, passing an entire generation imposing a middle finger to the sons. Richard was 10 when he took on the family business, and the sons deemed him maybe not the best choice for this kind of thing. His reign was considered by most to be the work of a child, which is exactly what it was. As well as not being a favourite with peasantry, he was hated by the nobility. Thomas attempted to undermine the king, and he led a coalition of powerful nobles against Richard in 1388, which saw the king's power significantly handicapped. This would set a trend for the near century to follow. One notable noble in that group was Henry, son of John, and so naturally carrying on the name of Lancaster. He, Thomas, and the others were satisfied in their victory and so would rest easy for a decade. Well, not too easy, they were still at war with France. Richard would inevitably strike back against this, and he did in 1397 by dissolving Thomas's coalition and arresting him, and also probably getting Thomas de Morbray to murder him too. Henry was spared the prison time and good old medieval shanking. Despite mercy, Henry was not happy with this turn of events and came into conflict with Morbray, eventually challenging the man to a duel of honour. Morbray accepted, but Richard intervened, banishing them both and upsetting the nobility, fearing they were losing their rights to the interventionist king. Whilst Henry was banished, his father, John, passed away in 1399. Richard held John's holdings and titles, keeping them from Henry. Henry was sufficiently fed up with Richard. Given there was no HR to file a complaint to, he decided to instead amass an army and invade England while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, seizing control in his absence. Upon Richard's return, he took the glorious route of giving himself up and going to prison. And dying. Henry became King Henry IV, and the Red Rose of Lancaster was established on the throne. Despite minor unrest, Lancaster rule endured, passing on from Henry IV to the V, who then indulged the whole death part of war in 1422, leaving his only infant son, Henry VI, to take up the throne. The young boy spent his early years in the regency of several noblemen, most importantly Richard, the Duke of York, the great-grandson of Edward III. When the weak-willed Henry became of age, he was convinced to marry the stunning, beautiful, and power-hungry French Margaret of Anjou. When Margaret arrived at Henry's court, she distrusted York and would constantly attempt to separate Henry from his staunch general. She proposed instead the talents of the Duke of Somerset, who happened to be one of her supporters, and also Lancaster. She continued to push York out of the picture, removing him from the front lines and instead to Ireland, where he could not play any role in the proceedings of the court. She instead gave York's former post to Somerset, who one could charitably say was not that good. The mounting failures of Margaret and her cronies, mixed with excessive corruption, left them widely unpopular by 1450, and what of the man meant to actually be running the show? Henry was viewed as beyond incompetent. York would return and prematurely march on London, demanding for Somerset's imprisonment. York was imprisoned until he would finally humble himself before the court and swear loyalty to Henry in 1453. Civil discontent grew to uncontrollable levels, and those responsible would have to be held as such. York and his Yorkist faction strived for Margaret, Somerset and their Lancaster accomplices' power to be revoked and their influence removed. That opportunity would be offered to them later the same year. Henry's failures led to defeat in the 100 Years' War, and his rational reaction was to have an absolute mental breakdown. A regency was set up in the king's mental absence, and the popular York was to take up the title of Lord Protector. York quickly got down to business and placed Somerset in prison and began to implement reforms. Before he could appreciate his work though, Henry managed to recuperate to his wife shrieking of how York is ruining everything. York's position was revoked, his reforms reversed, and Somerset released. York, alongside his ally, the wealthy Earl of Warwick, knew the Queen surely had it in for them now, and so rose their armies in the north of England in hopes of deposing Lancastrian power by force. The War of the Roses would begin on the 22nd of May 1455, when the White Rose of York combated the Red Rose of Lancaster in the First Battle of St. Albans. The battle would end in a decisive Yorkist victory and Somerset's death. Henry was captured by York, and his release was negotiated on terms that York would have his title of Lord Protector returned to him. Henry, being a poor loser, would once again suffer a bout of mental dysfunction for a period of months. He would recover once again to his wife's demands for York's disposal and would once again comply. This would cause York and Warwick to fear for their lives, as this time they felt Margaret would come down hard on their descent, and so would flee the country and go their separate ways in 1459. Margaret had them labelled as traitors and attempted to see to their arrest. York would stay in hiding as Warwick took the grander approach of defending his fortress in Calais and launching raids against the Lancasters. In 1460, Warwick turned it up a notch by straight up invading England and taking London and Kent to much applause. York and Warwick were far more popular than the corrupt Margaret and obedient Henry. The Battle of Northampton soon after Warwick's landing would see him meet the Lancastrian challenge and defeat it, capturing Henry. Again. York returned to England after Warwick did all the hard stuff so that he could assert his claim to the throne, having himself and his children designated as heir to the throne upon Henry's death. Margaret was livid. The only reason she came to this godforsaken island was for her beautiful child, Prince Edward, to become King Edward. She struck a deal with the King of Scotland for an army, and once she had that army, she raised hell across the counties of England. York and his second eldest Edmund met their end at the end of a pike, when attempting to face Margaret Scots in the Battle of Wakefield in late 1460. She continued her campaign southward, beating back Warwick in the Second Battle of St. Albans and discovering her husband sitting quietly beneath a tree. After retrieving the bargaining piece that was her husband, she retreated to the north to consolidate, leaving London without any king. The late York's eldest, Edward, would meet with Warwick and his surviving men and enter London. The Bishop of London would talk with the boy and then ask the people of London for their judgment. The crowds would shout back, "King Edward." As de facto king, Edward IV's goal was to remove Henry from power. He and Warwick would pursue Margaret's army and meet them outside York in the Battle of Towton on the 29th of March 1461. They fought a brutal battle accompanied by a blizzard and a dramatic narrative of revenge. In the end, 28,000 men lay dead and Edward stood the victor. It appeared as if Edward had finally ended the War of the Roses and a Yorkist victory. But if that was so, I'd be rolling pictures now and talking about how the war was significant or some faff, but I'm not. Warwick started negotiations for Edward's marriage to a French princess early, seeking to secure power for Edward. He was betrayed to discover that Edward had fallen in love with a widow and married her in secret. Warwick knew that Edward was far too ignorant of politics and deemed that he must right the wrong he had made. He threw away his ties to the Yorks and decided to instead side with the Lancasters. Warwick reached out to Edward's envious brother, George, and sailed to France to create an allegiance with his former mortal enemy, Margaret, on the request of the French king. After multiple marriages and several handshakes, a plot to depose Edward IV was in place. Warwick invaded England in 1470 as Edward attempted to suppress the Lancaster rebellions. Catching his former friend off guard, Edward was forced to flee. He chose to accompany himself with his youngest brother and loyal supporter, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Warwick decided to now toe the party line and use Henry IV, placing him back on the throne and offending George. George's whole motivation was to take the throne for himself, not to bring back the old guard. Make no mistake, Henry might have been on the throne, but it was Warwick calling the shots. Warwick had England befriend France and was tempted into a war against Burgundy, which proved to be a fatal mistake. Charles of Burgundy would offer the estranged Edward the funds to take back his throne, and so Edward would go to war. Edward invaded in 1471 and would meet his brother George, who would beg for forgiveness. Forgiveness he would be given. Edward then confronted Warwick's army in thick fog and using the confusion to his advantage advantage, defeated the outnumbering force in the Battle of Barnet and slaying Warwick. Margaret arrived on the Isle at the very same day only to hear of Warwick's demise. She decided to cast her lot and her men and confront Edward in the Battle of Tewkesbury. Edward proved the superior commander. Prince Edward, the cruel child, was killed and his mother taken captive by the Yorks. It was only by a ransom paid by the French king would she return home. The father would meet the same fate as the son. Henry VI was murdered soon after the battle, finally removing the Lancaster problem. York power was restored and the War of the Roses has finally ended in a Yorkist psych! Whilst the remainder of Edward's rule was fine, the problem of succession were bound to crop up. Upon Edward's sudden death in 1483, his son's succession was prevented by Edward's once loyal brother, Richard. See, there was a point to me mentioning him. Richard claimed that due to Edward's secret marriage, none of his children were legitimate, and so had the princes conveniently disappear so he could sit his behind on the throne of England. Richard III's mad and blatant power grab shocked onlookers, but surely no one remained to challenge his claim. That was the case until the discovery of Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian descendant of Edward III. Raised in exile on the sunny shores of France, Henry would cross the Channel in 1485 and confront the defrauding king in the Battle of Bosworth Field. Henry managed to defeat Richard's superior army and killed the man himself, leaving Henry the only one to claim the throne. To extend the olive branch, or to stop a bloody rebellion, probably the latter, he would marry the daughter of Edward IV, finally uniting the two roses to become the House of Tudor and bringing a little bit of peace to a tiny old island called Britain. With the end of the war also brought an end to the medieval era in England. The power shift caused by the Black Death in part had finally ceased and England became far more centralised under Henry VII. Henry's dynasty would pave the way for the English Reformation and the unification of England and Scotland under James I. Some say the significance of the War of the Roses is exaggerated and the war really meant very little in the grand scheme of it all, and to them I say... So that's that. Episode 8 done. To the archives it goes. Like usual, thanks to the patrons. I'm sure this thank you is feeling less genuine every time. Personal mentions to Zedfer and the scrubbings of the rectal variety. Next episode should be when I can be bothered.